My talk today is based on the article in the book displayed in front of you, which was actually included in your goodie bags. So if you have any further questions later and you can't think of now, lots of good stories and articles in that book. I have a pretty varied background. I wanted to emphasize that while I am here representing myself and only myself today, my full-time job is working at Carnegie Mellon University's Software Engineering Institute, where we're heavily focused on AI engineering, cyber, and autonomy. And that informs some of my current views on technology and people. But I spent a fair amount of time, there we go, working in the DoD. I was a naval officer, 1130. Subsequently, I co-founded a small business and sold it, and then went into finance, where I lived through the internet crash of the late 90s and the financial crisis of 2008. And that sort of gave me the opinion that humans are really profoundly messy. I believe that the technologists among us and the scientists among us, and I'm not one of those, are going to find answers to all the really hard technical challenges around propulsion and navigation and maintaining the habitat for the people, but that people are profoundly messy. And I base that on my personal experience of fighting in a couple of little bush wars or the aftermath of a couple of civil wars. And I find that the human factors always complicate, in a pesky way, those plans we lay so carefully. Drives engineers nuts. But there are examples we've had. Even back in 1971, there was a little application called the Oregon Trail. If you've heard of it, raise your hand so I can get a sense for everybody heard it. Yeah, more or less? All right. So the notion was you had to plan out, and as a thought exercise with the computer, usually on that green and black screen, move your wagons west from Kansas City to the West Coast and make decisions about what you bring with you, how big a wagon, how many people, do you use commerce or politics or force majeure to get ahead. And if you played it on the hard level, you usually got messages like this saying, you died of dysentery. In our discussion on interstellar travel, the outcome might look something like this, where it's looks of decompression in your wagon. But come on, there we go. If humans are that messy and that unpredictable, why bring them along at all? The notion is that why don't we use some hand-wavium, as often is employed by authors, and I'm guilty of this, where there's something that's faster than light, there's suspended animation, there's the miracle of sending them along as micro-miniaturized fertilized ova that are then raised, forced to maturity, and then raised by humans, and that solves all the problems about people in enclosed spaces for decades and avoids the whole Heinleinian generationship problem. This is a great dovetail into the previous speaker. I believe, and current practice bears me out, that humans are fundamentally inhibited against allowing machines to make autonomous choices about human life, especially in matters related to defense or war. So we're not comfortable, even though there's been weapon systems capable of making those, call them decisions, based on optimized weapons engagements rules, where we don't really turn the Aegis system to fully automatic and let it choose which targets to engage at which distances and with how many missiles. It's all done with humans in the loop. And for that reason, I think that we're going to be sending live people on this slower than light starship across the stars, which means we're going to bring our problems with us. So establishing that, can we as people even accept those kinds of restrictions? And I was looking for models for how people respond to being crammed together in a small space for a long time and deal with security. And we've got a model we've all probably experienced, which is going through the airport. And we already we're conditioned now to accept profoundly intrusive inspections of ourselves and our belongings, what we can say, where we can go. And for that matter, when we're on the actual aircraft, people have demonstrated the ability, collectively and impromptu, to respond to a threat, whether it's UA-93 or the shoe bomber, or more recently, this is in August of this year. I love the sequence of photographs. In the first picture, if you can make it out, there are two men arguing, the guy being disruptive, and the second guy saying, oh, no, you don't. Sit your butt back down. In the second picture, now there's 3 people involved. In the fourth picture, 4. In the fifth picture, there's 6 people, and the original guy who's being a jerk, his legs are up in the air because he's now being restrained. It took that long, which was not very long at all, for folks to collectively decide, no, sir, you're not going to behave that way. And he spent the rest of the flight in the aisle, bundled in his own clothes. So the example works. This is an example of security culture, which is both formal, the things you go through to get on the airplane, and informal, what we all seem to understand on the airplane. This is a flight Australia to Singapore, for what it's worth. So, what if it's not air rage? Are there models that we can use of extended duration human trips that share some of these characteristics that can inform us about how we would shape security culture on an interstellar voyage manned by people that are awake that's going to last decades or even generations? So I chose 3. They're not directly comparable. The 3 that I chose were had to share some of these qualities: isolation, cramped living spaces, an element of danger, an inability to communicate readily with your point of origin. So we have Endeavour, HMS Endeavour, 18th century sailing ship, 3-year voyage. We have the example of being on board a 20th century nuclear deterrence patrol submarine. 140 days is the current official unclassified maximum mission duration. And also wintering over at the South Pole, not at McMurdo, but at the actual South Pole at Woodson Scott, where it can get with the wind chill to below 100 degrees, negative 100 degrees centigrade. It gets really, really, really cold there with wind chill, which means they're completely isolated. You can't fly an airplane, and jet fuel, JP8, JP5, both freeze at that temperature. So, what are the variables from those models that we can consider? And I chose a handful. This is by no means comprehensive, but I think it's a good start. And the notion is that the duration of the duty means the longer it goes, the more likely the bad thing is to happen, whatever that bad thing is. So the longer the duty, the more dangerous. Crew size is not being discussed in terms of having enough genetic diversity, but rather that each person represents a potential point of risk as an actor, both either witting or unwitting, to do a bad thing, whatever the bad thing might be. And how long you can live without the shelter of your craft matters to determine that sense of shared, call it fate, shared responsibility for security. And then communications with a point of origin, which means if I can call back and refresh my onboard security culture by reaching in a rapid way the culture I'm familiar with, my point of departure, maybe that acts to make me a little bit safer. There's a great scene in a recent movie called Passengers where Chris Pratt's character wakes up by himself and he's exhausted. The ways that are immediately come to mind to fix the situation, being the only guy awake. So he goes to the communication shack on this starship, making about a 90-year voyage. He's halfway through, and after agreeing to pay about $80,000 to send a voicemail, it says, "Great, we're sending your voicemail," where he asked for help. It'll get there in 45 years. You have an answer in 48. He's like, does me no good. Your distance, that communications lag, is key to the sense of isolation that a crew might experience. So how much is enough? What is a kilo of security worth? The resiliency of your platform, in other words, the ability of your platform, the thing that you're on, your starship, your sailing ship, your submarine, your South Pole habitat, to sustain damage, to take a shock and bounce back and keep you alive, is highly pertinent to how much security that you need. The more damage you can take, the more risks you can take and survive, the looser your security organization can be allowed to be. Conversely, like on an airplane, that thin metal tube flying through the air at about 0.8 Mach, full of a bunch of strangers, is really fragile. And so the degree to which passengers are prepared to put up with malarkey is really low. Which is why we kind of have convinced ourselves to put up with all the security theater. So what is a critical point failure error? The thing that can make your platform die or be rendered incapable of supporting you at a single place is one critical point. If you're on board a sailing ship, and it's a wooden sailing ship with middle of the ocean, there's roughly more, you can argue more, but say 3 points of critical failure. You can run out of fresh water and not be able to get more before you reach land. You can lose your officers, few in number, that know how to navigate, so you never get where you're going. Or you might actually have a powder magazine explosion. The ship just blows up and you all die. All three of those places, the scuttlebutt where they keep the water, the powder magazine, and the officers, are protected in a special way, and there's rules about how you behave when you're around them. Similarly, on a nuclear deterrence patrol submarine, which has relatively low resilience, if you get a very small hole while you're at depth, that submarine will sink very, very rapidly. You have seconds to respond to a perforation in your pressure vessel. Although I was a SEAL, I worked on subs, but before I was an officer, I was an enlisted man, and I did a nuclear deterrence patrol on board USS von Steuben, SSBN 632 Blue Crew, back in the mid-'80s. There were, and this is now no longer classified because that submarine's been razor blades for a while, missile control, launcher control, the con, reactor control, and the torpedo room were all places that you could not go without people observing you, usually that were armed, because those were all places on that submarine where making an error that was critical, either on purpose or not, meant the submarine went away right away. And in addition to losing your life, that little detail, it's a major strategic deterrence platform, of which there are relatively few. So low resilience, high security. Moderate resilience, less security. What does that mean for a starship? Well, I postulate that a starship actually has dozens of things that can go wrong. It's ridiculously fragile. And if you have a lot of people on board, and let's pretend that we're staffing that starship with enough people to maintain genetic diversity, because the idea is to get the spaceship to a different solar system, to keep the human race no longer being confined to one basket. Well, that means you're going to have 160 people on a pretty big ship where a mistake in almost any compartment can vent you to space and create a really big problem. As resilience goes down, risk goes up, you need more security. Where you are in the voyage matters. So if you're building out and you're in near Earth orbit, you've got frequent comms, and you can go back and forth with some difficulty to your point of origin. If you're fitting out and you're doing testing, again, in system, rules similar to that apply, and you also have the proximity effect because your communications aren't delayed by weeks and days, it's by minutes. The challenge exists when you're in deep space, and I picked out, more or less at random, 5 things that can go wrong. The first one I'm just going to discard off the bat because I think the likelihood that our interstellar voyage is going to bump into aliens whose degree of technology advancement is exactly at the right level of sophistication where our defenses matter is so vanishingly small that it really resides in the realm of science fiction. So that's the framework that you would use for it. The next 2, engineers have figured out. The ship just breaks, okay, or you hit something. Those are engineering problems, and solutions for those exist in existing frameworks. But what do you do if you have an insider threat? What do you do if that's either witting or unwitting error? The existing frameworks that would address that are insufficient. So what do we need? Well, we need a new framework in a world already full of them. Business consultants love frameworks. It's a way to pump up those billable hours, make a lot of money. Ask them to eat McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group or KPMG or pick one. There are lots of them around, but fundamentally it's a way to think comprehensively of all the categories of risk and build a hierarchy of things you care about, and then begin to address the specific granular examples of critical point failure in every category of risk and build a mitigation plan. Fairly straightforward. NASA has a huge number of risk frameworks specific to different kinds of missions that you can download and read from their nasa.gov site. Are those enough for interstellar cultural security risk? I don't think so. By the way, these that I offer there are just examples. You can pick your own. There's plenty to choose from. The issue is, and this is not an engineering problem, is that humans like what humans like. If we accept that you need more security as resiliency goes down, and if you accept that spacecraft resiliency is, relatively speaking, low, and that the frameworks that we have talked about, or that you can think of, are inadequate to addressing long-term cultural security issues in a human population, well, then humans have to accept changes, whoever those humans might be. The good news is we're not very sensitive about things like class, consumerism, sex, religion, politics, personal privacy, how fit you have to be, what are the rules you use and the laws, and how you maintain discipline. Yeah, we care a lot about those things, and that's a huge source of conflict for people that are trapped in a small space, having done that multiple times in submarines, airplanes, and other places. So how do you address that? Well, humans will have to make changes. I'm not going to read through all of these. I'm going to pick a couple, and then we can take questions right afterwards. But one of the advantages of living on a planet is that planets are really, really resilient. So if we have a war, the planet's going to live through it, and the survivors still have an ecosphere around them. On a spaceship, that's not true, which means you have to have a different set of rules to how you would resolve conflict before it gets to violence. Humans love politics, because politics is better than war. But politics is a way to divide and segregate and enforce the majority's will, or the more powerful party's will, without resorting to violence, or that way to acquire the means of violence. I wonder if we can afford to have politics in a spaceship crew. Other examples harken back to the categories I've already mentioned: religion, privacy, language. An interesting thing about language: on extended maritime voyages in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, there was a specific, and remains today, specific, unique maritime language. If I wanted to attach two ropes together, I wouldn't just say time together. I'd say time off, bend that sheet to the halyard, rereave that block. There's very specific language that's employed so that a person under stress, under the worst circumstances, in the pitch of night, on a bucking deck, in a rainstorm, knows exactly which part of the ship they have to lay their hands on to fix, and they've got a language that they all understand specifically for that purpose. And that language drives, in part, culture. The culture in part drives the language. I would not be surprised to learn, if I could go forward 150 years and see a ship operating in these conditions, that the crew has, in fact, come to a unique variety of language for just their situation, for exactly that purpose. When I was running this against some of my colleagues for feedback at Carnegie Mellon, a couple of them said, "You're overthinking it. A lot of these problems solve themselves. Humans are adaptable." Remember, these are computer science engineers by profession. And again, humans are messy. I tried to suggest that culture drives the things that matters to us: first values, then social norms, legal norms, and in turn that drives how you think about security. And security ultimately is upstream of everything else. So I managed to save us some time in case the next person wants to go faster. We can talk about questions. We can go back to the slides as required. Anybody? All right.
One thing I noticed you didn't mention, Mike, was that in all of your examples, they were eventually going to get back to their home base. And the Starship is never going to get back to a home base. It's always going to be its own separate environment. How does that affect things?
Cultures have a life cycle. They emerge, they grow, they modify, they go through a period of effectuality, and then they senescence. They get less effective and they disappear. It would be really interesting to see whether or not you could maintain a shipboard culture that was anything, it was recognizable as what began by the time you make it to the end of the voyage, especially if you're going to go across generations. You know, we have segregated ourselves for the purposes of consumerism, and we call ourselves boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and millennials. And the jokes around how we fight internally are, a matter of internet meme legend. How would that work in a confined ship? I don't know is the answer. But that's a great point.
Great talk, Mike. The point where the resiliency driving the culture, the lack of resiliency driving the culture, are there any examples you can think of the reverse process where, given that there's a culture we want to preserve or we won't give up, how it might drive the decisions on what an interstellar mission has to look like?
Do you have an example you're thinking of?
So symbol of like, if we don't give up democracy
Mm-hmm.
on that's the culture that we want to send out there. You know, pictures of how it goes in reverse, as opposed to like what it needs to be.
I am minded of the experiment that took place during the Spanish Civil War in the late 30s and early 40s, when Franco was trying to hold on to his government, and there was, broadly speaking, and it was more varied than this, a communist-backed effort to field an army against the then Franco government. And that army tried very hard to bring egalitarian Marxist principles into their command structure. There weren't officers. You didn't say, oh, colonel or captain or private. You were all comrade. And so they had a heck of a time fitting that egalitarian framework into a combat effective field force. And ultimately it handicapped them in having a group that you could maneuver in, a group's larger than, okay, this is sort of my family and my tribe and all the folks that we know, and they all kind of know that I'm in charge. They couldn't field a division or a battalion or a brigade, let alone combat arms beyond infantry, that didn't have that stumbling block. In a similar way, I think that the Darwinian survival selection process would rapidly winnow out efforts to have culture drive your resilience and your security, because at your first mistake, you've got a perforated pressure hull. That's a problem. Whereas if you err too high on the side of security, it may not be comfortable, but it may be adequate. Westerners, I'll take myself as an example, I value certain democratic ideals very heavily. I recognize that those may not be compatible with long-duration spaceflight security requirements. For example, I love my privacy, and I think as an American I should be able to have my own place, my own single-family dwelling in my own little nook of suburbia, or my walk-up loft in Soho in Manhattan. But you know what? I don't get to pick that. That doesn't exist. Likewise, fitness. No one can tell me how fit or fat I can be. Oh, wait, yeah, they can on a spaceship. So we may not be well suited as a Western democracy to field a tiny part of that and make that the culture for a spaceship. I think there's a question on the far side. I'm sorry, right here. I'll take it back. Sir.
Okay. When Columbus chose to sail off the edge of the world, he took 3 ships. The decision to take 3 ships, how would you apply that to spaceflight?
How much he could afford, how many he was able to cadge out of Queen Isabella, I guess, when she hawked her jewels. I mean, that's part of the mythos. One of the differences is that those ships could readily communicate and stay close to each other. I'm not a space pilot. I'm guessing that'd be a harder thing to do in intergalactic space. And the benefit would be that you could have greater resiliency for the overall mission. The downside would be, what if those ships have culture that varies between them and they decide to have different rules or different destinations or even fight each other for resources? So it's an interesting idea. I like it because more is better for resiliency. You've heard the old saw, 2 is 1, 1 is none, and 3 is not enough. So yeah, 3 ships, sure.
I was curious when you were talking about the idea of how do you have politics on a spaceship. It made me think of the Robert Heinlein young person's novel, Citizen of the Galaxy. And I wondered if you had read that, if you were familiar with the Mortier system. And I mean, it's a very anthropological book, very culture-driven. And I just wondered if you would comment on the system that he describes there.
So you're referring to the Urko-Finnish spaceship called the Sisu? So that was really interesting because they actually, and for the folks who may not know, the book had a shipboard culture around the idea of a moiety. So you had 2 subfamilies or 2 clans, and there were strict rules about who could talk to who in what circumstances. And it was a way to maintain more about cultural control than necessarily security, but that was certainly an element of it. And they would compete internally. I'm a huge Heinleinian fan, so I bring a bias to that. I think it's an interesting idea because in his gathering concept, all the ships represented different original terrestrial cultures. So I'd like to see what their solutions were writ large, not just for the Sisu. But there's an element of mysticism and religion in that as well. Remember the ceremony where they put the blood in the deck and they stamp on it, blood in the steel, steel in the blood, now you're part of us. I was thinking of that actually during your talk.
And they actually had an anthropologist, Margaret Matter,
Yeah.
on board. So that's a good idea. Put an anthropologist on a ship.
I just wanted to enthusiastically support and extend your comments about how the specialized language and culture evolved. I, for 15 years, led a team doing rocketry out in the desert, far away from urban centers. And it was a group of 20 to 60 people. And after 5 years, when NASA people would come by, we couldn't talk to each other. We had found all of our own. We'd have meetings where we'd get together and say, we can't all keep calling this whatever we feel like calling it. When we're in the middle of a test and we're all doing a hazard activity, we have to know what it is, and it can't be a 16-letter acronym we borrowed from NASA. You know, we got to agree, is that the front or the bow or what the hell is it? But we're going to name it and we're going to call it and we're going to enforce it. And after just 5 years, we had diverged from the rest of the aerospace culture so far we could barely communicate.
That's a great point, because rocket fuel is highly energetic, and if you don't get it right, it can take your fingers and worse.
Well, yeah, the opportunity for inadvertent or deliberate malfeasance to cause you all to die is very strong.
All these charts and so forth are in that book that goes in your goodie bag.
So reinforcing again, what you also see is you see that in medical procedures. It's got to be exact, which actually raises one of the things that you see a lot in science fiction is the idea that you end up with a caste system on your ships, because your crew has to have the culture and has to adhere to all of the rules, and then your passengers, everybody else is a second class, a lower caste, because they can't make those decisions and are limited. I just wondered your opinion on that, whether that's the sort of thing you might see continuing this security culture.
The cultural drift is something I can't predict. It depends on what strictures are in place and what rituals are in place to reinforce the rules that make you more likely to reach your destination. It may be that a strict theocracy is the way to go, because it's more likely to keep people in line. I'm not sure that I would want to live under those conditions, but there are certainly fictional examples that are persuasive. Again, going to Heinlein, 1958, Orphans of the Sky, the generation ship that gets lost, and the caste system that grows up, and the mutants on board, and all the rest of it, and the original crew of the ship's titles, the captain, the navigator, they're now kind of like God and the apostles, and they're spoken of in that reverent, allegorical way, because obviously the ship is not a real ship. This is our world. That's how so the drift has gone on for so long. The answer is I don't know, but if I get a chance to be on a starship, I'd rather it not be a theocracy.